Admiral Jonathan Hastings moved through the echoing hallway of the San Diego VA hospital with the same clipped efficiency he used on a ship's bridge, because this was supposed to be a routine courtesy stop between meetings. A few photos, a few handshakes, a speech on gratitude for service, then back to the base where his staff had stacked briefings like ammunition, all under a tight schedule that didn't leave room for detours. He scanned the waiting area as he walked, noting the usual scene. An older Marine arguing politely with a clerk over lost paperwork, a Navy corpsman helping a Vietnam vet steady himself with a walker, a row of men in ball caps that read Korea, Vietnam, Gulf, some asleep with their chins on their chests. He'd done these visits for years, and he meant what he said in them. But the routine had formed its own armor. If he let every story hit full force, he'd never stand upright again. That's why, when his aide tugged his elbow and murmured that the director wanted him to speak on the upper floor, he almost walked straight past the thin, pale man in the dark wheelchair by the window. The man sat slightly apart from the others, turned toward the glass instead of the TV, hands folded on a blanket that covered one missing leg. He wore no unit hat, no pinned metal replica, nothing that screamed "Please notice Emmy," which was exactly why Hastings stopped. Years of reading crowds had taught him that the loud ones usually got their thanks. It was the quiet ones you had to watch for. "Give me a minute," he told his aide, because he could already hear the director rehearsing a speech upstairs, and it could wait. He stepped toward the wheelchair and saw the name printed on the chart clipped to the back. Grant, William H. No rank, no branch, just a date of birth that reached back to 1946 and a VA number. Hastings came around to the front because you don't stand over a man like that. You face him. Grant's eyes were gray and clear in a face mapped with fine scars that faded into the white stubble on his jaw, the kind you don't get from shaving incidents. Hastings did what he always did first. He thanked him for his service, because even if you don't know details, you can honor the fact that someone signed a blank check with their life on it. Then, almost out of habit, he added the little question he used when he wanted to build a bridge, the one that turned scripted thanks into something specific. "What was your call sign?" It was meant as courtesy, a simple way of saying "I see you" as more than a patient number. Grant didn't blink, didn't hesitate, didn't glance away the way some do when asked to revisit something heavy. He just looked straight at Hastings and gave an answer that shouldn't have existed outside a story. Shadow 1. The two words hit like a small explosion inside Hastings' chest, because every SEAL who'd been anywhere near real training knew that name. And they all knew it as myth, not as a man in a wheelchair by a hospital window. Shadow 1 was the ghost instructors whispered about to POWs candidates during the worst of hell week, the whispered example when someone said one man got it done alone in the jungle. The legend used to prove that impossible could be done if you were ruthless enough with yourself. The story changed depending on who told it, because rumors mutate, but the bones stayed the same. A solo operator in Vietnam who ran deep missions behind enemy lines, a man whose work never made it to the newspapers, who supposedly rescued POWs the government later claimed had never been there. Officially, Shadow 1 didn't exist. Unofficially, his name had become a test. When Hastings was a young lieutenant, one instructor had leaned over his boat in the freezing Pacific and hissed, "You think you tough." Shadow 1 laughed at river leeches and NVAs. "You boys just count the hours until you can quit." Shadow 1 was an idea, a shadow on the wall of the cave that made men walk farther just to see if they could catch it. Yet here was an actual human being, skin and bone and missing leg, speaking that impossible call sign like he was ordering coffee. For a moment the hospital noise blurred. Hastings heard the squeak of a gurney wheel, the low murmur of the TV, the distant echo of someone coughing down the hall, but all of it faded behind the single thought that hammered in his head. If this man was telling the truth, then everything he'd been taught to treat as legend had a beating heart and a social security number. Doubt pressed in immediately because doubt is how the brain protects itself from disruption. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe the old man had heard the stories and adopted the name. Maybe this was just a frail veteran with a good ear for folklore. Hastings could have nodded politely and walked on, could have written it off as one more old tale in a building full of them, because his schedule, his staff, his whole day pushed him relentlessly toward the elevators. Instead, he did something that changed the next months of lives. He stopped treating the encounter like a photo op and started treating it like an op order. Shadow 1, he repeated slowly, not as a challenge but as if he were tasting the words against every story he'd ever heard. Grant's face didn't shift, but there was a flicker in his eyes that looked like weariness and old exhaustion braided together. That flicker told Hastings two things at once. This man had heard disbelief before, and he had no energy left to argue anyone into believing him. Years of leading men in combat had taught Hastings that stories get bent by time, but scars don't. So instead of pressing, he thanked Grant again, laid a hand briefly on his shoulder, a gesture that said, "I will not forget this," and stepped away because he needed information before he pushed any further. His aide, confused but obedient, fell into step as they headed for the elevator. "Sir, the director's waiting," the aide whispered, like time itself might file a complaint. "He can wait another 5 minutes," Hastings said, already pulling out his phone. He wasn't going to search Google. That would be pointless for someone who was never supposed to exist. He opened the secure personnel portal instead, the one tied into the Navy's deeper archives, and typed the name from the chart, William H. Grant. The system spat out a few entries: boot camp, a brief stint on a conventional ship, and then a gap. After 1967, there was nothing, as if Grant had evaporated for the exact stretch of years that mattered. Then, in 1973, a single line appeared: honorable discharge, med separation. No mention of unit, no medals, no combat history, no casualty reports, no Purple Heart, no Bronze Star, nothing that would suggest the man had done more than peel potatoes stateside. Hastings felt the hair rise on the back of his neck because that pattern meant something else to anyone who'd be near classified programs. Records scrubbed, footprint erased, service folded into a black box where the cost was paid and the ledger quietly sealed. The absence wasn't proof by itself, but it was enough to justify curiosity. Curiosity, in a 4-star, is dangerous because the institution doesn't like being asked questions it has already buried. Still, Hastings owed too many ghosts to walk away. So he made his first deliberate move. He called the hospital director and canceled his upstairs speech with a lie that was also a truth. "We have a service matter that needs immediate attention," he said, because honoring a buried man's story was a service matter, even if no manual had a section for it. Then he requested a private room for a quiet conversation with one patient, because if he was going to pry open old wounds, he wasn't going to do it in the noise of the waiting area. The VA staff jumped, because admirals don't usually reschedule their own talking points. Within 10 minutes, Grant's wheelchair had been rolled into a small interview room that usually hosted social workers. Hastings walked in without entourage, carrying only a small digital recorder and a legal pad, and sat opposite the old man. It would have been easy to turn this into an interrogation, but Hastings knew that approach collapsed men who had built their lives on compartmentalization, so he framed it as what it truly needed to be: an invitation. He asked where Grant had served, and how, and why his records looked like someone had taken a red pen to them and never bothered to retype. At first the answers came in short, careful phrases, each one weighed as if it might still send someone to jail. But as hours passed and Hastings listened more than he spoke, the story began to unspool in a way that made the myth feel small. Grant had been a farm kid who barely knew what the ocean looked like when he enlisted, had volunteered for observation missions he didn't understand because a recruiter said the word challenge like a dare, had been told he'd be supporting larger teams, and then found himself again and again pushed forward alone, because his quiet, precise way of moving through jungle and river made him the perfect ghost. He described 13 solo operations with the offhand detail of a mechanic describing engines, not because they weren't traumatic, but because the only way he had survived them was by stripping off the emotion and focusing on the mechanics. Insertion point, radio silences, routes, fallback options. He spoke of nights spent belly-deep in swamp water while NVA patrols passed a few feet away, of counting breaths to stay calm as leeches crawled under his clothes, of the simple, brutal math of deciding which targets he could touch and which he had to leave behind because the exfil route wouldn't support extra weight. On one mission, he found 2 POWs in a jungle camp that wasn't supposed to exist, men who were so thin their skin hung off their bones, their eyes rolling with fever. The plan had been reconnaissance only, mark the location and let bigger, louder assets take over later. But later doesn't mean anything to men who might not live through the night. So Grant made a decision that no policy manual had authorized. He moved closer, took a calculated risk on the guard rotation, and created his own extraction with nothing but wire, a stolen AK, and the knowledge that the river ran slower 2 clicks south. That decision saved 2 lives and cost him his leg when a mine detonated during the escape, an explosion he described in one sentence. "I remember the sound more than the pain, because the pain belonged to someone he used to be." When he woke up, groggy and bandaged, it wasn't to cheering. It was to silence and a clipped explanation that the mission he thought he'd run had never officially happened. No one said, "We're grateful." They said, "You will never speak of this," and they backed it up with branded folders and signatures. His citation for the loss of limb mentioned a training accident, because it was easier to lie on paper than to admit the government had sent a single man into a camp it later pretended didn't exist. When Grant came home, he discovered that an injury without a story is just a disability, and a sacrifice without paperwork is just a misfortune. Over decades, as agencies reorganized and wars changed, his name slipped further into the cracks. He tried, at first, to fight it, to ask for corrections, to write letters, but the replies were always the same: no record found. Eventually, the effort became heavier than the leg he'd lost, so he stopped pushing. There's a kind of second amputation that happens when a man lets go of being believed. For 50 years, he wheeled himself through VA clinics and grocery store parking lots and family gatherings as just another vet, while his legend mutated into campfire talk for young SEALs who needed something impossible to measure themselves against. Hearing it recounted badly hurt more than his stump did, so he quietly stopped correcting anyone who got details wrong. The story belonged to the machine now. He was just a patient number with a scar that the intake forms reduced to combat-related, unspecified. As Grant spoke, Hastings felt pressure building from 2 directions. One from the past that demanded he do justice to what he was hearing, and one from the present. The Navy, the Pentagon, the press, that would not welcome a 4-star stirring up old ghosts. He knew that if he filed a formal challenge to 50-year-old records, the request would bounce through offices like a grenade, hitting legal, intel, public affairs. Every one of those sections would ask a version of the same question: why are you poking this? Yet the alternative was wise, because if he walked out of the room and let Grant's story die with him, he would add one more layer of silence to a man who had already been buried twice. So he made a second deliberate decision. He flipped the recorder on, laid it between them, and said they were going to treat this session as an oral history, classified, limited in circulation, but real. Over weeks, he came back again and again, fitting in hours between other duties, collecting the episodes of a life that had never been allowed to exist on paper. They talked about the 13 missions, but also about what came after, the long nights where phantom gunfire popped in his dreams, the marriages that failed under the weight of secrets he couldn't share, the way he would flinch when someone clapped in a crowded room because his whole nervous system still lived half a second ahead of the present. Hastings didn't sanitize any of it because he understood that hero worship does as much violence to truth as erasure. The recordings were transcribed by a small, trusted team who didn't ask questions they weren't cleared to ask. Each transcript was stamped with classification markings that meant nothing to the outside world, but everything inside the community. In the SEAL training pipeline, there's a point where instructors talk about lineage. Who came before? Who set the standards? Until now, Shadow 1 had been a silhouette in that speech. Hastings arranged for the truth to slip quietly into that section, not as a recruitment poster, but as a closed-door briefing for instructors and senior team members. They read, in carefully redacted excerpts, about a man who had carried more risk on a single mission than most would in a tour, and then come home to a country that couldn't even say his name. The story changed how they told the myth. Instead of saying some say he was a ghost, they could say, behind sealed doors, he was a man named William Grant, and this is what we owe men like him. That might have been the end of it, a classified oral history, a quiet correction inside a closed world, a man finally acknowledged in a way that didn't feed public spectacle. But cause doesn't stop when the paperwork closes. One of the junior officers on Hastings' staff, a detail-oriented lieutenant named Rodriguez, was assigned to cross-check names mentioned in the interviews against casualty and POW lists, not to challenge Grant's memory, but to anchor it. While doing that work, she caught something that pulled a new thread. One of the POWs Grant had dragged out of the jungle was listed as Lieutenant David R. Kennard, MIA 1968, presumed dead, later marked return 1973. The file looked ordinary at first glance. Standard debrief, medical notes, a thin stack of paper in a dusty digital folder. But in the notes was a line about Kennard's family, including a son born shortly before he shipped out. That son had grown up without a father for 5 critical years, believing him dead, then watched the man stumble back into life with a limp and haunted eyes. Kennard died in 2011 of heart failure at age 70, having lived 43 years longer than he would have if one man in the jungle had decided reconnaissance meant observe and leave. Rodriguez, thorough as ever, tracked down a contact email for Kennard's son, now a middle-aged mechanic in Arizona who kept his father's medals in a showbox. She didn't share anything classified. She simply said that an internal review of Vietnam records had suggested his father's rescue had involved risks that had never been properly acknowledged, and asked whether the family would like to share any reflections for a private memorial record. The reply came back 3 days later in the form of a carefully typed letter. In it, Kennard's son described what those additional years had meant: a father at his Little League games, a man who taught him how to change brake pads and say sorry when you were wrong, a grandfather who held his first grandchild and cried so hard he had to sit down. He wrote about the dark times too, the flashbacks, the drinking, the nights his father sat on the porch staring at nothing. But he framed them inside gratitude, because imperfection is still more than a folded flag. If he hadn't come home, the son wrote, I wouldn't be here. My kids wouldn't be here. Every good thing in my life grows from the day some man in that jungle decided my father was worth the risk. Hastings read that letter alone in his office first, then carried it in his hand like something radioactive as he walked back into the VA hospital weeks later, because paper like that changes the weight of decisions. Grant's health had dipped and rallied in the intervening months. Some days he was too tired to speak more than a few words. Some days the old sharpness came back and he argued about small details in the transcripts, because accuracy mattered more to him than hero labels. That day he looked fragile, skin papery, breath a little thin, but his eyes still tracked the door as Hastings walked in. There were no cameras, no staff, just an admiral and an old man with a blanket over the stump of his leg. Hastings sat down and explained, as far as the rules allowed, that someone connected to one of his missions had written a letter, a private one, not an official commendation. Then he handed the pages over. Grant held them carefully, fingers trembling slightly, and at first Hastings thought it was age, but as he watched, he recognized the other thing causing the shake. Fear. Not fear of danger, that had burned out long ago, but fear that this, too, would be some bureaucratic framing that turned his life into a neat paragraph with all the blood removed. As he read, his breathing changed. The letter didn't talk about missions or politics. It talked about a father teaching a boy to ride a bike without training wheels, about a man sitting at the dinner table telling bad jokes, about a grandfather gripping the pew at his granddaughter's wedding as if he were afraid the moment would float away. Every line made a simple point without saying it directly. All of this existed because, on a night deep in enemy territory, someone refused to leave a man behind when the orders were to observe only. For decades, Grant had carried the amputated leg as proof that he had been somewhere doing something. Yet the amputated years had gnawed at him harder, the years when he looked in the mirror and heard "you made it up" in the silence of unanswered letters. Now, in black ink, the math finally balanced. A life saved had turned into more lives, into family jokes, into ordinary, stubborn love, and the man who had made the decision could see the result in words instead of imagining it. He did not break down the way sentimental stories like to show. He didn't sob or make speeches. He just closed his eyes for a long moment, like someone feeling a weight finally lift off a nerve, then opened them again and handed the letter back, because he understood that the paper itself belonged in the file, not in his pocket. You kept going when the country pretended you hadn't, Hastings said quietly, because some truths deserve to be spoken even in rooms where most things are left unsaid. We can't give you a parade. We can't rewrite what they scrubbed. But we can make sure your story isn't myth anymore. Inside our community, we'll remember you as you were, not as a campfire ghost. That was the compromise the institution could live with. No medals pinned on TV, no headlines that would force explanations, but also no more shrugging and saying some say he was a legend as if legend meant probably not real. The oral history of Shadow 1, now labeled with Grant's real name in classified files, circulated in controlled ways among teams and training cadres. When young SEALs stumbled through their own private hells in POWs, instructors still invoked the story, but the tone changed. It wasn't a bragging rumor about a superhero. It was a sober reminder that the men who came before them had paid in flesh and years and anonymity. Some of those candidates would later find themselves in dark, dangerous places with impossible choices, and when they faced the moment where doctrine pulled one way and conscience pulled another, they might remember a quiet man whose reward had been 50 years of being told his missions never happened, and decide that saving one life was still worth every lost line on their record. Months later, when William Grant's heart finally gave out after yet another infection, the VA printed a standard burial flag and filled a standard form, because the public system still only saw what was officially written. The obituary in the local paper mentioned his branch but not his missions. At the graveside, the crowd was small, a few family members, a chaplain, a couple of hospital staff. But one other figure stood back near tree line, hands folded behind his back, dress blues precise even in the breeze. Admiral Hastings didn't step forward to speak because drawing attention to his presence would defeat the whole point. Grant hadn't wanted a spectacle. He had wanted truth. So Hastings stayed in the shade and listened as the folded flag was handed over, knowing that elsewhere, in a secure facility, there was a hard drive and a stack of transcripts labeled oral history. Grant, William H. K. Shadow 1, along with a scanned letter from a mechanic in Arizona who owed his entire existence to a decision made in a jungle before he was born. That silent archive became the memory anchor the world would never see, not a statue in a city square, but a story inside a community that understood exactly what it cost a man to live and die without official applause. In training classrooms, when instructors clicked to the slide that used to say Legend of Shadow 1 with a blurry photo of a river, the image changed to a darker screen with text that simply read, "Some men will never be on a poster. Remember them anyway." Then, in a voice that carried both respect and warning, they told the story of a farm kid turned ghost who came home to a government that pretended he never existed, and of an admiral who, years later in a hospital hallway, asked a simple courtesy question and got an answer that turned a myth back into a man.